Sunday nights he couldn't make it, so I went ahead and jumped in the Gospel of Matthew. So I thought I would go through bits and parts of Matthew in the events he can't be here until he finishes up his epistles of John. So remind you guys again, this Wednesday night will be a business meeting, so be here at 6 o'clock for that. So don't forget, no Bible study Wednesday night, but we'll be here for a business meeting at 6 o'clock. So let's take a look tonight at the story where Jesus pays the temple tax. And he has no money to do so, but he figures it out. You guys know this story. Matthew 17, 24 through 27. All right. When they came to Capernaum, and let's just pause, and I always put these maps on the screen. So if you're familiar, we're the Sea of Galilee. There's fishing communities all around there, little communities where fishermen live. And on the northwestern corner of the Sea of Galilee is a city called Capernaum, which is interesting in the New Testament time because it's notable for a few things here. In fact, I'll put this on the screen here. We'll talk about Capernaum real quick here. It's called the Field Repentance or the City of Comfort. There's two different understandings of what the city of Capernaum means, but that's the gist of it. It became Jesus' hometown. Now, you know that he's born in Bethlehem, but that wasn't his hometown. And we know that he was raised in Nazareth, which was his hometown until something happened. Does anybody recall what happened that made Jesus switch hometowns? Made him pick up and move?
Wasn't they didn't like him.
That's the Cliff Note version.
Yeah, I mean, he was a false prophet. They thought he was crazy.
That's right.
And prophet in your own country.
Yep, can't be a prophet in your hometown. A prophet is without honor except in his hometown. And you're going to say? Basically that, right? His first public sermon in his hometown of Nazareth, he reads from the scroll of Isaiah, and after that they run him out of town. Because he says, today this is fulfilled in your hearing. And he claims that the prophet was talking about him, and in fact he was talking about him. But they couldn't fathom that this little boy they saw growing up and playing, Pee Wee League football, and I'm just making that up. But in the synagogues, and all the things they saw, they couldn't fathom that this little boy of Joseph was the Son of God. And so they really run him out of town, more or less. And so he picks up residence, and he moves to Capernaum, which he goes from Nazareth back east towards the Sea of Galilee, and he settles in Capernaum, which happens to be the hometown of a fisherman named Peter. Look at the next slide here. So Jesus left Nazareth and went to live in Capernaum after meeting temptation in the wilderness. You read the Gospel of Matthew chapter 4. After the temptation, he goes right and settles in Capernaum. And then, of course, we see that historically, Capernaum is believed to be the home of Peter and many of the disciples. If you take a Bible land tour today, they'll take you to Capernaum. It's one of the stops on the trip, and they'll take you to Capernaum, and they'll show you two sites in Capernaum today where they believe archaeologically resides Peter's house, where he lived as an adult, and 2 doors down a synagogue where Christ preached multiple sermons in Capernaum in that synagogue. So now, when we see the story of Jesus healing the man who was paralyzed, you remember they lower him down through the roof? Many scholars think that was in Peter's house. And when Jesus says, suffer the little children to come to me, and he lets a little child sit in his lap, many folks think that was Peter's daughter. But many scholars think all these stories take place in Capernaum in a house that is Peter's, where Jesus took up winter. Because if you recall, when Christ began his public ministry, he had no house. He liquidated all of his assets, right? He gave all of his assets, he gave rights of his property to his younger brothers to care for his mother, Mary, because Joseph has been dead. And so the next brother in line, James, would have taken care of Mama as Jesus went on the road preaching and teaching as he started his teaching ministry. So when he lives in a house. In fact, Jesus says, the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but I've got no place to lay my head. What he means is he was living in borrowed houses. He was staying in places temporarily. And one place we're pretty sure he lived in Capernaum would have been Peter's house. And now we know Peter lived there because he had a fishing business, right? He and Andrew, his brother, had a fishing business, and right down the street was James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who also had a fishing business on the same sea here in Capernaum. So this is a little fishing community. And where do we meet Matthew? In Capernaum, right? I believe he's there collecting taxes. They bring the fish out of the water, out of the boats. He's counting fish and charging them taxes on the fish as a Roman tax collector. So a lot of things happen in Capernaum. So we'll move on here if we can. So now these men from Jerusalem in the south come up to collect the drachma, the 2 drachma tax, which is an annual tax, we'll see in a moment, that was collected from Jewish families and households, every year, the month before Passover, they took up this tax. So that's what it was. So they said the two collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter because he's the head of the house. It is his property. He's a Jewish man who resides in this town. And they say, does your teacher not pay the tax? They know Jesus is there, and they say, the guy been following the last, this little while in his teaching ministry, does he not pay the tax? Peter says, of course he pays the tax. He's a good law-abiding citizen. He pays the tax. Now let me pause here and say this. Jesus didn't carry a pocketbook with him. He didn't have a bag of coins. But he had someone that did that, right? Who was the treasurer of the group? Judas. Very good. And when people would give Jesus money for ministry, he didn't hold on to that. In fact, he never had any currency on him. In fact, twice he's asked for money in the Gospels, and he always says, hey, somebody bring me a coin. They say, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? He says, hey, bring me a coin. Hey, yeah, thank you. Whose inscription and image is this? Caesar's. Thank you. And they say, we're going to pay the two coin tax of the temple. And he says, hey, Peter, go fishing and find me a coin. Jesus never has cash on him. Judas is always is the money collector of the group. And not that money is dirty, right? Not that money is a bad thing. Money is a morally neutral thing. Money can be used for good or for bad, right? The same money that can buy a loaf of bread to give to a poor family can be used to buy bullets to kill the guy on the street, right? Money is a neutral thing. Money has no moral connection whatsoever. But he has Judas who has the money bag, right? He just seems to never have cash on him, which is not a bad thing, I suppose. I always had a debit card like me, right? That's why he didn't have cash. But anyway, so he says, yes, my master does pay the tax. So Peter knew this was an ongoing thing that Jesus always did. Look at the next slide here. Let's spend some time and talk about this 2 drachma tax very, very, very quickly here. The 2 drachma tax was a religious tax imposed by the Jewish religious leaders on the population. The tax was supposed to support the temple in Jerusalem. So when the temple stood, there's just household things you need for any structure, right? You got to pay to buy oil for the lamps. You got to pay to have it, cleaned and taken care of. It's just upkeep of any structure. That's what the temple tax did. Look at the next slide. Now, originally, the tax was a half shekel, which is a Jewish currency of silver. It was imposed to support the tabernacle in the wilderness. When they left Egypt in captivity, they built a tabernacle, which is the tent of meeting, which was the forerunner for the temple. And to maintain that structure, they took the tax up way back in the wilderness. The tax was unchanged when the temple was built, meaning they kept taking the tax ongoing every year. However, it was temporarily reduced to 1/3 shekel by Nehemiah when the exiles, we'll go back in time a little bit, were returning to Jerusalem because they were poor. So there was one time they had a tax decrease. It's because they couldn't afford to pay that tax. And Nehemiah said, we'll reduce it by 1/3 and you'll just pay less tax than normal. So that was the only time it was reduced. But it was always ongoing, this little tax. Look at the next slide. According to Josephus, he's a first century historian, the half shekel was equivalent to 2 drachmas. Nah. I know this money exchange means nothing. What's a shekel to a drachma? What's a drachma to denarii? These are first century ancient world coinage. Let's see here. It was called the 2 drachma tax, even though there was not a single coin worth 2 drachmas. You just had to give 2 drachmas when you paid this. In fact, this is a coin minted in this city called Tyre. This coin was found there. It's a drachma minted in that city. And on the Sorry, Siri. This refers to a tax worth 2 denarii. Now, a denarii coin was a day's wage. Now, let me pause here and say this, that a day's wage is relative, isn't it, among us? There's some folks who might own real estate in New York that might make $1 billion a year. So their daily wages is pretty high. There might be folks who are struggling to make ends meet on minimum wage, and their day wage on an 8-hour shift is whatever that would be. A day's wage is relative in our understanding, but a day's wage was a fixed amount back in that time. In Jesus' day, the tax was approved by the Romans, this 2 drachma tax, this 2 days' wage tax. The Jewish religious leaders were free to collect the money during the month preceding the Passover. So it was cool. Once a year, the Romans said, if you want to collect this tax, we're not going to enforce it. If the people don't want to pay it, we don't care. It's not our tax. It's a Jewish thing, and if people want to pay it, they can pay it. However, the Jews were free to pay it or not pay it. Consequently, it was collected before Passover by men who went through, as we see in the story here, Canaan, through all the promised land. Now, this is a very important question we ask here. Was the 2 drachma tax a secular tax by the empire of Rome, or was it a religious tax? Religious tax. The Romans didn't enforce the collection of this tax. It was truly a Jewish tax. What was it used for?
The upkeep of the temple.
Right. Twice in Jesus' ministry, he's asked about paying taxes. Once is paying taxes to Caesar, and he says, show me a coin whose image and likeness is on it. And they say it's Caesar's. We then give to Caesar what's his. And the second time he's asked about paying taxes is being paid to the temple upkeep. It's not the same as paying federal or state income tax. That's not what this is about. It's like paying tax to government or paying tax to your religious group, like an offering of some sorts. Look at the next slide. Why is the temple tax no longer collected? Very good. There's no obligation to pay this tax. What was the purpose of that temple that stood there that Solomon built, and then it was torn down, and then they remodeled and rebuilt, and then Herod remodeled it after it was tore up by Antiochus? What was the purpose of that temple? It served a function. What's one major thing the temple offered the Jewish people? Take a guess. What happened to the temple? Maybe that's a better way of phrasing it.
It was the meeting place of God.
Yep.
Where they met God.
Very good. And it was a place of sacrifice, wasn't it? God would come down and he would accept or reject their sin offering that year. And that was a place of highly religious significance. In fact, the Jews said that the temple was the center of the universe. They believed in a geocentric universe. The earth was the center of the universe, and then the center of the earth was the temple itself, where God came down and spoke to the creation. Now, we don't go to a temple. This church ain't a temple, right? I hope you don't think the church is a temple. This church is a church. Paul in the New Testament said that our bodies are the temple because we house the very living God within our bosoms. The Holy Spirit resides in us. So we don't go to a temple. We take the temple wherever we go with us, which is a kind of a neat concept there. Look at the next slide here. Does your teacher not pay the tax? Now the question is phrased negatively, they assume he doesn't pay the tax because Jesus has been very critical of the status quo. Your teacher doesn't pay the taxes, does he? And I think these kind of questions are meant to trap him, because if he says no, then they can come back later and say, well, he's a non-Jewish temple tax-paying guy. He doesn't believe in the function, the purpose of the temple and the priesthood. But instead, Jesus, he does pay that tax. Look at the next slide here. Did Jesus ordinarily pay the temple tax? What did Peter say when they asked if he paid the tax? He said, yes, of course he pays it. He's an adult male. He's had his bar mitzvah. He is under the law. Of course he pays the temple tax. Why do you think they phrased the question negatively? Does he not pay it? Why do you guys suspect that might be the case? Cameron, you got a question?
Because they think he doesn't.
Yeah, they assume he doesn't, right? That's the assumption that they have, that he doesn't pay it. They probably assume so because he's been very critical of the religious establishment of his day. That's exactly right. Let's look at the next slide. Now, when he came into the house, this is Peter's house. So, I'm going to assume this is it. Jesus spoke to him as Peter, first saying, now Jesus will address Peter because Peter has been confronted by the temple collectors. Now it's been Peter who has had the conversation with the tax collectors. And so Jesus pulls Peter aside inside Peter's house, and he has the conversation. Look at the next slide. What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take toil or tax? From their sons or from others? He's given them multiple choice. You've got two choices, your sons or the others. At this point, the Jewish rulers and those collecting the tax did not understand that Jesus Christ was Lord over the temple. Who owns the temple in Jerusalem? God. Who is Jesus? God. They shouldn't have asked Jesus to pay the temple tax because he should have been exempt because he in fact was God. They should have been paying him temple tax. Does that make sense? But because they are so backward in their thinking, they don't know he's the Son of God. He doesn't look like any other man walking about the city streets of Capernaum or wherever they would have seen him walk about. They don't know he's the Son of God. They have seen him do miracles at this point in his ministry. They've heard him teach. They've seen him multiply loaves and fishes. But they just can't fathom, in fact, he's God. In fact, Jesus, in fact, is God. He should be exempt from paying the tax because he is God. But he will pay it without question. Because he came submit to the law, didn't he? Now, look at the next question here. Why do earthly rulers tax those more harshly who are not in their household? You might be surprised how little tax politicians do pay. They find ways not to pay taxes, even though they insist that you pay yours. And this is not a political
You really think we'd be surprised?
You may not be surprised to realize, if you look at tax returns of politicians, how much they don't pay in taxes, but demand that you do of yours. How much truer that would have been in the ancient world with kings who would have taxed people. Did the kings start taxing people in their household, or did they exempt themselves and tax others? Well, like anybody else in power, they exempted themselves from the tax, but made others pay. Jesus says, look, when they came to collect taxes, Peter, they were showing that they didn't know who I was. If they knew who I was, they wouldn't have been paying the taxes to me, because I own the temple in Jerusalem, because I'm in fact the God that they claim to be worshiping. So that's what he's saying here. The fact that they're collecting temple taxes from me shows they don't know who I am. That's what Jesus is trying to say here. Now, Jesus is going to not just say these words, Miss Judy, he's going to go and prove that he is the God of the temple. And here it is. Look at the next slide. And when he said this, and Peter said from others, look at the next slide. Jesus said to him, then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you'll find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself. Now, and this is Peter here. Now, the only two people that are where the miracles even happen is Jesus and Peter and this poor fish with the coin in his mouth. Now, I'm not sure what kind of bait you use to catch a fish that has coins in his mouth, but whatever it is, it certainly worked. Now, this fish was in the Sea of Galilee by divine decree, and it didn't have any kind of a coin. It had the exact coin needed to pay the temple tax, isn't it? So what God was doing here, Jesus was doing, he was demonstrating his divinity, wasn't he? This is not the first time Jesus had demonstrated his power over sea life. Because when he first calls Peter to ministry, he says, Peter, cast your nets on the other side of the boat. Remember, he drags in the fish, and Peter says, my Lord, my God. And he falls. He says, get away from me, I'm a sinful man. Peter realized Jesus was God when he first caught that big catch of fish. And what he's done for Peter's faith is he's reassured Peter that I'm going to pay this tax because I've been born under the law, but I'm God. I put that fish in the sea, and the first fish you catch is a fish with a coin in his mouth, and it's not some silly drachma, it's a full shekel. I'm going to double pay what's needed here. Cameron?
Also, Jonah and the whale, he demonstrated.
How's that?
Well, he demonstrated his divinity because he kind of controlled the whale.
Oh, that's right. That's right. So in the Old Testament, we see a story of Jonah and the well, where God closes the mouth of the well or keeps Jonah safe. But in Jesus' ministry in the Gospels, he does show power of fish, doesn't he? He makes fish jump into a net. He makes fish have coins in their mouth. Maybe you've gone fishing in your life and you've caught an old muddy boot or an old bicycle tire or something, right? You've done that if you've been fishing. You drag along the bottom. Well, this guy's caught a fish with the coin in his mouth. Is there another slide there after this? A couple more slides, isn't there?
Yeah, just two.
Okay. So does this story teach about paying taxes to secular government? No, it has nothing to do with secular government. Does it teach about us paying taxes to a temple or anywhere? No, it doesn't even do that, does it? Look at the last slide here. What does this miracle teach us about Jesus? This story teaches a few things about Jesus. Let's unpack this as we close out tonight. What does this story briefly teach us about Jesus? A few things we understand about him.
He's God.
He is God, right? Who else can say, go catch a fish, and the first fish you catch has a coin in his mouth, this exact dollar amount? Well, he's got to be God to do that, doesn't he? Okay. What else so that's the important takeaway from the story. Of course, Jesus is now divine. We know that to be a fact by what he does here. What else does this story teach us about Jesus?
He obeys the land. He obeys to what they do in the temple and stuff.
Amen. Yeah, he didn't want to cause any trouble at this point. He wasn't breaking any of their commands. In fact, God said way back in Exodus, take this drachma tax to pay for the temple. And Jesus Christ was going to be obedient to the law to the point of death, wasn't he? He wasn't going to break any of God's laws. Now, he broke a lot of traditions, but he broke none of God's laws. Cameron, what's your thoughts there?
He has control over everything, including like the sea life and fish.
That's right. He's God, and he has control over even fish, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Very good. And he wasn't, pardon the pun, rocking the boat unnecessarily. He was obeying by the law of the land. Any other thoughts?
He wasn't asking anybody to do anything that he wouldn't do himself.
Oh, very good. Now we do think, I don't know what point it gets where tax is unlawful, right? And we're about to get there, right? But there's a point when people collect taxes from you that it becomes an unlawful point, and you may have the right not to pay that tax. But taxes aren't a bad thing entirely, are they? They keep roads paved. They keep police in uniform. They keep fire departments going. They keep schools open. They're things that we have to do for society. So I'm not an anti-tax person, and I hope that you're not either. But this story is not about secular government taxes. It's about upkeep tax for the temple, which did exist, but is now defunct because it's been done away with for sure. Any other thoughts before we close out tonight? I can hear a pin drop, Miss Gina. Isaac, what's your thoughts, my friend?
It's more of a silly thought, if I'm honest. Sounds like I want to go fishing in Israel more often.
They pay for your trip over there for catching enough fish. Very good. I suspect this was a one-time thing, though. Be cool if it was I couldn't even catch coins in a coin fountain. You know, I mean, it's bad luck as I have, but apparently he did it.
Find things in fish.
Yeah, fish do eat things.
Alligators. They used to find a lot of stuff in alligators down when I was.
That's right. Alligators eat all kinds of things.
Lots of dog collars.
Ooh.
Seriously.
Must have been a catfish, because catfish eat kind of bottom feeders, aren't they? Eat somebody's coin they threw out there. Anyway, Jesus Christ, of course, is God over nature. And even as God, he humbled himself, became a man, even to the point of being obedient to the point of the cross. And under the law of the Old Covenant, he even paid these taxes, which gives us encouragement, doesn't it? Okay. Let us pray, and then we'll close out with a song. Father, we thank you for allowing us to come in your house tonight.